Welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we are going to unpack a truly fascinating, deeply psychological, and intensely spiritual text. In today's Explainer, we're focusing on a concept that honestly almost everyone encounters at some point, but very few people actually know how to navigate. We're talking about the quietest, most difficult moments of faith. We are going to visually break down an incredible source text titled The Divine Purpose of Spiritual Silence. So let's jump right into this. We are starting right at the absolute heart of the problem presented in our source. Think about this for a second. What if the scariest part of your faith is actually when God finally goes quiet? The author paints this really vivid, completely uncomfortable reality that so many of us face. Picture it. You wake up early, you pour your morning coffee, you sit down to pray or read, and instead of that familiar comfort or peace you usually rely on, there is just nothing. You speak, but heaven feels completely, utterly silent. And what happens next is this profound psychological spiral. You seek, and you feel absolutely nothing. The source text acknowledges this really terrifying, often unspoken fear. When you don't feel that spiritual connection, the immediate human assumption is usually, okay, it's me, I'm doing something wrong. Or even worse, God has pulled away entirely. The author notes that this is the exact moment people start endlessly scrolling through their phones, right? Just doing anything to distract themselves from that lingering, haunting thought of spiritual abandonment. The text actually explains exactly why we feel this immediate panic, and it does so by comparing two totally different operational frameworks. Look, in our modern culture, we expect instant replies, constant notifications, real-time emotional feedback. If someone goes silent on us, we just assume they're ignoring us or they simply don't care. But the text argues that God's strategy operates entirely differently. It involves hidden phases, seeds growing in the darkness, and what the text calls the wilderness. We're essentially projecting our modern communication habits onto the divine, and that is exactly where the anxiety begins. That brings us to our first major concept from the text, Section 1, the wilderness by design. Here, the author delivers this massive paradigm shift. Silence is not the absence of God. It is actually the strategy of God. This spiritual dryness we're talking about, it's a feature of the design, not a bug. The text argues that silence is specifically used to strip away distractions and force us to ask the really hard questions. Are you seeking God for comfort or for truth? Are you just in it for the warm emotional feelings or for the actual relationship? It basically forces you to look at your true foundation when all that emotional dopamine fades away. Let's look at this timeline to see how the source builds this historically. The author anchors this concept deeply in Scripture, proving this definitely isn't some new, modern phenomenon. We're looking at a chronological rite of passage here. First, you have the prophet Elijah, who, right after a massive victory, flees to the desert, weary and afraid. Second, Jesus Christ himself spends 40 days fasting in the desert right before starting his public ministry. The text heavily emphasizes that for Jesus, the wilderness wasn't empty, it was formative. And third, that leads directly to the modern believer. According to the text, we are called to walk that exact same path. To really cement this historical context, the text brings up Elijah's encounter in 1 Kings. Think about it. Elijah didn't find God in the roaring wind or the earthquake or the blazing fire. No, he found him in a still, small voice. The author's takeaway here is so profound. God often speaks most profoundly not in the noise, but in the silence. But as the source notes, to actually hear it, we have to be willing to stay there, to listen, and to trust, instead of just running right back to the noise of the world. Moving deeper into the theological mechanics of all this, we hit Section 2, the dark night. The text brings up this famous and honestly often misunderstood concept called the dark night of the soul. Originally articulated by St. John of the Cross, this is a highly recognized period of spiritual dryness. But I want you to really note the end of that definition. It is meant for purification rather than punishment. The text explains that God deliberately removes the emotional consolations we constantly rely on so he can draw us closer in a much more authentic way. So if you're sitting there feeling like you're being punished by the silence, the source argues you absolutely aren't. You are simply being purified. And this brings us to a fascinating question. What exactly remains when all those good feelings are gone? Citing Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, the author explains that true faith is the substance of things hoped for. Leaving the wilderness too early is a critical mistake. People assume the silence means stop, so they just disengage entirely. But the text proposes that this exact moment of emptiness is actually an invitation to move beyond our emotional dependence and finally step into genuine spiritual maturity. It's faith in its absolute rawest form. The source uses the Blessed Virgin Mary's fiat at the Annunciation to brilliantly illustrate what that raw faith actually looks like in practice. "Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it done to me according to thy word." The text points out that Mary didn't have all the answers. She couldn't see the full path ahead of her. Her response was rooted entirely in deep trust and commitment, not in demanding clear answers or immediate comfort. And that right there is the exact posture of surrender the wilderness requires of us. Conceptually, this is all amazing, but practically speaking, how do we do it? That brings us to section 3, anchors in the wilderness. How do you actually navigate this totally dry spiritual wilderness without just throwing your hands up and quitting? Well, the author lays out these 3 highly actionable steps as critical anchors to keep you grounded. First up, you have to persevere in dry prayer. Even if it feels totally routine or empty, you just have to keep showing up. Second, utilize the sacrament of reconciliation. The text points out that when you're in the silence, you're forced to confront your own fears and attachments, which makes confession an incredibly powerful tool for tangible healing. And third, rely on the constant presence of the Eucharist. Participating in Mass acts as this massive anchor because the reality of Christ's presence there remains completely unchanged, regardless of how cold or distant your heart might feel on any given Sunday. To back up those 3 anchors, the source points to a very direct biblical promise from Matthew 28:20. "I am with you always, even to the end of the age." The author makes a really pointed, crucial note here. According to the doctrine presented in the text, this is not just some nice poetic metaphor. It is a literal promise. Even in the dead silence, the relationship remains intact. God is working in ways you cannot possibly perceive yet, and his presence is absolute, completely independent of your lack of feeling. Which transitions us to the ultimate payoff of all this. Section 4, from silence to purpose. If you can actually endure this quiet, super uncomfortable season, what exactly is waiting for you on the other side? The source reveals that the entire purpose of this silence is to build a much deeper, stronger version of you. Because the noise is finally gone, your priorities naturally shift. You stop asking, why isn't this working for me? And you start asking, what is this season trying to teach me? The silence literally builds a resilient, unshakable faith. It forges someone who doesn't just crumble the second things feel uncertain, someone who can handle real responsibility without needing a constant pat on the back. Let the sheer gravity of St. Teresa of Calcutta's wisdom sink in here for a moment. She experienced years, literally decades, of profound spiritual dryness, yet she famously said, "God is not calling me to be successful, but to be faithful." The text uses this quote to beautifully emphasize that your true purpose in the wilderness isn't found in some sudden moment of clarity or huge emotional high or immediate success. It's found entirely in fidelity. Ultimately, purpose is found in that fidelity. It is the simple, daily choice to remain, to believe, and to love, even when heaven seems completely quiet. The text concludes that this passage of silence always precedes a profound transformation. Just as the desert came before Christ's ministry and the cross came before the resurrection, your silence is simply a sacred space of preparation. You aren't losing your way out there. You are actually finding it, just without all the extra noise. We're going to end today's explainer on this incredibly powerful, lingering question pulled directly from the source. What if God's silence isn't absence, but an invitation? It completely challenges everything we naturally assume about the quiet, difficult moments in our lives. The source leaves us with this thought. Maybe we just haven't learned how to hear in the quiet yet. The wilderness isn't where your faith dies. It's exactly where it's reborn. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. I really hope this deep dive into the source material leaves you reconsidering your own spiritual wilderness. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.